Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time this hour looking at a couple of different issues in the news, try to give you some kind of point, counterpoint, and some perspective on that. First of all, we have the announcement by the Attorney General that the Justice Department will be suing the state of California. So I want to get into that in just a minute. I won't spend a lot of time on it. It's just kind of breaking news, but I wanted to cover that for sure. Then I want to get into some questions about the Second Amendment, a piece that we have posted here by David French. He's been on the program with us before. Why the left won't win the gun control debate. We'll get into a little bit more about this whole debate about gun control and Second Amendment, since it's still in the news, and I thought it was a really thoughtful piece. He's actually written a previous one that appeared in The Atlantic, really trying to explain to people that maybe aren't around guns, have maybe never been part of the gun culture, if you want to call it that, to just try to explain what's going on, and the responses to that have caused him to realize we're never going to bring this together. Of course, one of my commentaries on the divisive debate is something we'll get into as well. And then I want to talk a little bit about tariffs. We haven't done too much about that, but it's in the news. And, of course, you have one of the members of the Trump cabinet stepping down, so I want to get into that. And so that's kind of what we'll try to cover in this first hour today with you. In the second hour, we'll come back to our Millennial Roundtable. And Hannah Sultemeier, who was with us yesterday briefly, she was part of a roundtable with Penna Dexter, will join me, and we're going to talk about the millennial generation in general. An interesting piece that just came out the other day by John Quiggin, Millennial Means Nothing, which I agree with, and we'll get into that more. And then we'll talk with her about how, in one sense, the millennial generation is the most pro-life generation, although they, number one, wouldn't necessarily refer to themselves that way, because that sounds political. And number two, I want to get into how tolerance and some of that affects their values. Because a while back, John Stonestreet, who, of course, writes for Breakpoint Commentary, put it this way. He said, the millennial generation is the most likely to be pro-life, but the millennial generation also most likely to drive a pregnant woman to an abortion clinic. Now, if that causes your head to hurt for just a minute, we're going to try to sort out why that is the case and why so many millennials are coming to the conclusion, not necessarily from a biblical conclusion, because after all, the millennial generation may be the most secular of all generations. So what is it exactly? So I think we're going to have a really good discussion over the next couple of hours, but let's get into the news at the moment. And that is the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, actually issued a very stern warning. And this is something that he said in a speech to the California Police Officers Association in Sacramento. He said, I understand that we have a wide variety of political opinions out there on immigration, but the law is in the books and its purposes are clear and just. And so he announced that there is a lawsuit that they're going to file against the particular policies of the state, and this will be filed by the Justice Department. He went on to say there's no nullification, there's no secession. Federal law is the supreme law of the land. He said, I would invite any doubters to go to Gettysburg, to the tombstones of John C. Calhoun and Abraham Lincoln. This matter has been settled. We can get into historical issues there, but nevertheless, they have filed a lawsuit against California to block 3 so-called sanctuary laws that the legislature passed last year. The laws dictate how local jurisdictions should interact with federal immigration authorities. and he believes that these are harmful to the state's residents and prevent law enforcement officers from doing the job. And the example he used, which I want to get into in more detail in just a minute, is the Oakland mayor. The Oakland mayor last month warned residents of an impending immigration and customs enforcement raid. That would be an ICE raid. And they were unable to locate hundreds of individuals. And so he said, here's my message to the mayor. How dare you? How dare you needlessly endanger the lives of our law enforcement officers to promote a radical open borders agenda? So this is kind of the news today. And if you're not familiar with this, and I would imagine you might not, because I'd mentioned it last week around our roundtable, and one of our roundtable guests was not familiar with this. So if you want to understand kind of how divided we are as a nation, all you have to do is look at what happened in Oakland, California. Because I've always sort of wondered, how far will we go? We've got sanctuary states, got sanctuary cities. What's next? Well, I think we have the answer now, and that is the Oakland mayor 2 weeks ago, a little less than 2 weeks ago, warned the immigrant community that ICE agents would be conducting various operations in the area. And then this was interesting. She also warned business owners that California was a sanctuary state, and therefore it was illegal for them even to assist federal immigration authorities in any way. Well, it turns out that ICE did conduct sweeps through the area. Of the suspected immigrants they caught, are you ready for these numbers? 150 had prior felonies or what were called significant or multiple misdemeanors on their records. But they also estimated that about 850 targets of the operation escaped because the mayor tipped them off. And the mayor has been, up until now, unapologetic and argued that it was her duty and her moral obligation as mayor to give those families fair warning. She went on to say it's a myth to believe that immigrants are dangerous criminals. Okay, fair enough. Many of these immigrants are not dangerous criminals, but what about those that had already committed felonies? We're not talking about individuals that are on the roll simply because they snuck across the border. These are individuals that have committed felonies. Sometimes they have not been apprehended. Maybe they've committed a felony, but even jumped bail. There are all sorts of, issues. But Tony Brass is a former federal prosecutor, and I saw one of the interviews he did the other day with one of the local San Francisco Bay Area papers, and he said her actions put agents in danger. He said you put the police in danger, you put your neighbors in danger, and the reason is this. If you are a felon immigrant and you know they're coming, of course, a lot of them are going to just take off. But what if they don't? Well, they're going to then meet them at the door with what? A smile or something else. And so, again, in my commentary that will be out next week, I say take the word immigrant out of the equation for a minute. Would you be concerned if the mayor of a city warned felons that a police raid was about to show up at their apartment or home? Well, of course you would. So that's why I think the actions by this mayor are so dangerous, and maybe gives you at least a little bit of an understanding why the Attorney General, not trying to pick a fight, but nevertheless says, enough is enough. We have a number of laws that have now been passed by the California legislature that actually make it difficult for law enforcement officers to do their jobs, may be even harmful to those law enforcement officers and are harmful to the states. And if you disagree with a law, if you disagree with a judicial decision, get it changed. But don't engage in secession. Don't engage in nullification. And that is exactly what is taking place. Or in this case, don't engage in civil disobedience and expect that there aren't going to be consequences to those. So that's an issue in the news today. I'll open up the phones a little bit later, but when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about why the left won't win the gun control debate. This David French piece, I think, is really thoughtful, and it might help everybody on both sides to understand what's going on. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Ryan Anderson responds to our transgender moment in his new book, When Harry Became Sally. He begins his discussion by comparing two movies. The classic film, When Harry Met Sally, explored the question of whether a man and a woman can really be just friends. More recently, the film The Danish Girl asked a different question. Can a man really become a woman? The film was based on the true story of the first known subject of sex reassignment surgery. America is in the midst of what has become the transgender moment. When he was on my radio program, we talked about how fast this all took place. Most Americans had never heard of transgender identity, but within a year it became the latest civil rights cause. He said that the book in many ways provides support for the actions by Dr. Paul McHugh. He is a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School who raised important questions about the effectiveness of hormonal treatments and sex reassignment surgery. This 250-page book with 30 pages of endnotes attempts to provide a comprehensive look at the transgender movement and policies that have been proposed to address the demands of transgender activists. We also talked about how transgender concepts are being taught in the schools. There's the genderbread person that is supposed to help children sort through how their gender identity and gender expression relates to their biological sex. And there is the gender unicorn that is supposed to help them understand who they may be physically attracted to and emotionally attracted to. He also documents how some young people exhibit gender dysphoria but later become more comfortable with their sexuality. Transgender activists have so misrepresented this book that I wonder if they even read the same book I read. That is one more reason why I recommend that you get the book and read it for yourself. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Irwin Brothers Entertainment, I Can Only Imagine. Rated PG in theaters March 16th. More information at ICanOnlyImagine.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll spend just a little bit of time talking about Second Amendment gun control issues because, if nothing else, it's still in the news. And it's maybe helpful sometimes to see how different views are arrived at, and maybe is there any possibility to really begin to bring about any kind of dialogue and compromise. And David French makes it pretty clear in one of his pieces in which he says why the left won't win the gun control debate. Now, let me encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. It's the first article we've posted. In a minute, I'm going to quote from our second article, and then we'll get into questions about tariffs in just a minute. But he says, first of all, that he wrote an article, a very long essay, actually, in The Atlantic, and he has a link there, so if you would like to read both of those, you can do so. But let me just summarize it real quickly. He has been in the studio with us before, but lives, in Tennessee now and finds himself really in a place where you aren't necessarily surrounded by people that don't understand a gun culture, but he recognizes because he writes for National Review and because he travels to New York, he runs into people all the time that don't understand that. So he wrote this explaining that one day when he was miles away, his wife sees this car pull up and block their driveway, and this man is looking for him, and it's pretty obvious this man wants to do David French harm. After all, he's been speaking out on a lot of social issues like all of us do. She was able to diffuse the situation, but then he kind of explains how eventually you start saying, maybe it wouldn't hurt for my wife and for me to at least have access to a gun because, as I've said before, when seconds count, the police are only minutes away. And out where they live, they could be lots of minutes away. And so he talks about, you go to a gun range and first of all, you go to a gun shop, you find out about the various weapons, those kinds of things. You go to a gun range, you practice, and you really are a very responsible person. And this is just beyond even the understanding of a lot of individuals who have never grown up around guns, never thought about getting a gun, or live in states where getting a concealed carry license is virtually impossible. And so he says, I was trying to describe this to some of the readers that were there that aren't necessarily typical readers of National Review. Then you have, of course, the article that Bethany Mandel wrote in New York Times, which has been just vilified, which, again, trying to explain why she decided to buy a gun when her family was threatened during the 2016 presidential campaign. And he said the goal of both of the essays were similar: to destroy stereotypes and to explain that the individual decision to purchase and carry a gun isn't rooted in some sort of strange gun fetish or Wild West swagger, but rather in the fundamental desire and the right to protect your loved ones from harm. If arguments for gun control don't grapple with this reality, he says, they're destined to fail. And he said, yet the responses to both of the essays, the one in Atlantic was something, but the one in New York Times was just beyond the pale, but you can read those for yourself. He said, help demonstrate why the left keeps losing on guns. He says it simply cannot persuade a rational, reasonable adult who's experienced the threat that they're safer without effective means of self-defense. Indeed, the effort to make this case is so often rooted in condescension or ignorance that's deeply alienating. And he talks about 3 different kinds of responses you get. And then I want to open up the phones and find out from some of you that have maybe expressed your opinion about guns. Maybe you're a gun rights person, if you've ever heard these. Or maybe if you are a gun control person, say, well, yeah, maybe I've used these, and these probably aren't the best way to win the argument. Because he says the first is the odd argument that it's somehow illegitimate to make a decision based on fear. Oh, my goodness, you see that so often in some of these Facebook posts. Or as one correspondent put it, fear and paranoia. And he said this makes no sense. Americans make safety-based decisions all the time. Is it wrong to buckle a seatbelt because that's a fear-based decision? Should you ride a motorcycle without a helmet just to show the world that you're not scared? He says reasonable people take precautions in the face of real threats. Now, recognize that in both cases, the ones he cites, Bethany Mandel as well as, of course, David French, they faced a threat. So the first one is just this sort of, if you will, this argument of condescension. You know, you should not base your decisions on fear. Well, fear is in our emotional repertoire for a very good reason. Fear keeps me from just always looking over a balcony without holding on. Fear keeps me from not doing a lot of really crazy things that a lot of teenagers do and that shows up on YouTube with very tragic results. That's the first one, fear. The second one, next, you're immediately hear that you're foolish. You're more likely to hurt yourself than defend yourself. And again, how many times have I run into this argument? In other words, the gun is more dangerous to you and your family than it is to any given criminal. But he says if you're speaking to a responsible, non-suicidal adult, then this argument is flat out wrong. We've had John Lott on this program, by the way, to say that. But again, let me go back to David French. He says, in fact, even when you include suicides in this analysis and compare them to the best estimates of annual defensive gun use, you'll find that law-abiding Americans use guns to defend themselves far more than they do to hurt themselves. And, of course, if you take out the suicide component, because, again, we have more suicides than are reported. Lots of times when you hear about an accidental gun shooting, well, that was just a way to protect the family. It was a suicide, and everybody in law enforcement sometimes knows that, but it's just better not to report it that way because we don't want to embarrass the family. But he goes on to say, moreover, another person's irresponsibility is irrelevant to my existence of my fundamental liberties. I don't surrender my free speech rights because another person uses theirs to troll Twitter. I don't surrender my right to free exercise of religion because other people join a cult. I don't surrender my inherent and unalienable right to self-defense because a man across town decides to kill himself. So that's the second one, condescension. Second one is you're foolish. Number third is finally there's a concession that in your circumstance, It's your need. And that's what he says here. Finally, if there's a concession that in your circumstance it's reasonable to own a gun, then critics will immediately tell you exactly what kind of gun you need for self-defense. Well, you don't need a large capacity magazine. You don't need an assault rifle. Shotguns are best. You don't need anything other than a pump action 12 gauge. But he says these arguments fall apart the instant one considers the real world. If the most reasonable, foreseeable threat is from a person with a semi-automatic handgun and a large capacity magazine, then how is it possible that you need less? Think about that. I've talked about this before. As a matter of fact, we have a booklet coming out that I've written on the Second Amendment, and that's one of those issues that just if you look at the self-defense argument alone, you, as I've said on this air before, have to recognize that that sets aside the idea that the Second Amendment was about muskets or flintlock pistols, because if you have an intruder, let's say it's a burglar, it's a mugger, maybe it's a terrorist, comes into your home, comes into your community, what will he or she most likely be carrying? It's not going to be a musket. It's not going to be a flintlock pistol. It is not going to be a revolver either, by the way. That's one of the reasons police rarely carry a revolver anymore, because they're going up against bad guys that have what? A large capacity magazine. They have a semi-automatic handgun, or they have a semi-automatic rifle. And so, again, he goes into giving you some of the philosophy behind John Locke and some of the others. But again, he says that faced with a generation of defeat in the gun debate, the left is increasingly turning to one of its favorite weapons in the culture war, stigma. It's mobilizing its tribe, including progressive corporations, Hollywood, and the mainstream media, to not just make policy arguments, but also to shame and insult Americans who disagree. The goal is to make gun ownership culturally toxic. But he says also that shame is weaker than love. Gun owners who've experienced the threat possess or carry a weapon because they love their families. Teachers who wish to carry a weapon at school do so because they love the kids under their care. These folks know that their responsible gun ownership makes their communities and families safer. So he concludes by asking this question: why does the left keep losing the gun debate? Because it's hard to persuade any man or woman to surrender an unalienable right, especially when exercising that right helps preserve the most vital of all, the right to live. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back, and the second article we've posted is one of my commentaries, which is called The Divisive Debate. Why has it become so toxic? Well, once you start labeling people in very inappropriate ways for issues that don't involve life and death, the only place to go, unfortunately, is down. So we'll talk about that as well. But if you'd like to join the conversation, maybe you've been frustrated with the gun control debate and the Second Amendment debate, I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. And then we'll get into the whole issue of tariffs. That's an issue front and center, and we'll talk about that as well, but we'll also take your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. These articles on our website. Feel free to read them, print them out, and pass them around. We'll be right back.
From Irwin Brothers Entertainment comes I Can Only Imagine. The untold true story of Mercy Me's Bart Millard and the power of redemption and forgiveness.
My dad was a monster, and I saw God transform him. I didn't think that God could do that.
I Can Only Imagine. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. In theaters March 16th. More information is available at ICanOnlyImagine.com.
When you listen to the news, do you ever feel like you're living on a different planet from those presenting the headlines? We've always known there was a subtle bias, but today, it's about as subtle as stepping off a 1,000-foot cliff. The only way to counteract that bias is with the truth. To join the Truth Team at Point of View, your support will educate and encourage potentially millions every day. Don't let lies win. Step up so that lives and our nation can be changed. Join the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Lots of issues on the table today. We've talked about immigration. We talked a little bit about this debate about gun rights and gun control and the Second Amendment. Just a few minutes we'll get into, if we have time, into the whole issue of tariffs and trade. And in the second hour, we'll have kind of our millennial roundtable. Hannah Sultemeier will be with us, and she's with Stand for Life, and we'll get into some of that conversation with her and with you as well. Let's take some phone calls, though. We'll go to Texas first of all. Emilio, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Start us off. What would you like to share with our audience?
Yes, sir. Thank you for hearing me. I just want to comment. I wish someone would start a movement, a national movement, to put God back into our schools. This would solve our whatever gun problem they think we have.
Well, there is a
That's
lot
all.
of argument for that, because think about this. As I've said before, you can go to some of the schools in the 1950s and 60s. They had gun clubs. Kids came to those schools, sometimes rode on buses, subways with rifles, usually. Now, most of the time they were unloaded, but not always. I know some that were loaded even in the classrooms, but they were set along the side, and they used them later for their gun clubs or for their hunting clubs or whatever.
Yes.
We didn't have these kinds of shootings. As a matter of fact, crime has gone down. Violent crime has dropped precipitously in the last 2 decades. That is easy to document, but the number of school shootings has gone up. Well, what changed? Well, God went out of the classroom. God was taken out of the classroom. Prayer was taken out of the classroom. Bible reading was taken out of the classroom. The 10 Commandments were not allowed to be posted in the classroom. These are all Supreme Court decisions in 1962, 1963, 1980 with Stone versus Graham on the 10 Commandments, and on and on. And then we have the problem.
Yes.
And I think if you take God out of the classroom, you put all sorts of kids' noses in violent video games, and you have a breakdown of the family,
Yes.
those are pretty toxic measures that have given us what we have today, don't you think?
That's the root of the problem. That's the root of the problem. Someone start a movement. Let's get back to basics. Our Lord Jesus Christ back in school.
Well, I think you've got a very good idea. We certainly want more of that to take place. It's amazing how they're taking not only God out of the classrooms, they're taking even Christianity out of any public arena. One of the things Kelly Shackelford is going to share with us on Friday, and you may have already heard about this because Todd Starnes talks about this, there is a particular, I think it's an assisted living home, that actually has a sign, and I'm glad they took a picture of it, said, "No Christian music, no Christian messages in this facility." And I'm thinking, oh, goodness, we can't even have adults, senior citizens, have Christianity. And, of course, you've heard some of the cases that Kelly Shackelford at First Liberty are dealing with right now. So, Amelia, you've got some really good ideas, and I think let me take another call that sort of parallels that. We'll go from Texas to Tennessee this time. Chris, I think you have your finger on what you think the problem is. Go for it.
Yes, sir. We don't have a gun problem in this country, regardless of what the left and liberals and the Democrats think. What we have is a people problem and a spiritual problem. We don't have any human contact or any human fellowship anymore in this country. Our children and our youth are all wrapped up in these video games, and they want to, instead of getting together and talking like we did when we was kids and hanging out and playing football and kick the can and stuff like that, you know, they want to sit beside one another and text one another instead of talking, you know, and if they get into an argument over something, instead of them dealing with it like normal, rational human beings do, well, the snowflake society that we live in, somebody gets their feelings hurt, and they automatically think that they've got to have retribution because of the violent video games, I guess, or the crazy society that they've grown up in.
Yeah, lack of impulse control is part of it, you know, that I just act out, and I've been able to get away with that for so long, and if you tell me what I've done is wrong, then I have the snowflake reaction to that of you're hurting my feelings. And so, again, we'll probably get into a little bit of that in our next hour when we talk about some of these issues in the Millennial Roundtable. But I think you've put your finger on it. It's not so much a gun problem. It's a people problem. Now, I admit we have more guns today than we had in the 1950s and 60s. And so, you know, maybe we have more guns than we need. But who's the person that's supposed to make that decision for us? I got a feeling that you could put a lot of guns around some really safe, law-abiding citizens, and we would not have any of those problems. As a matter of fact, I know just down the road from us here, we're going to have the National Rifle Association annual convention. I suspect that that's going to be a room full of, and a convention hall just full of guns. And yet I don't think there'll probably be a shooting there, because if you are around people that know how to handle firearms effectively and they're rational individuals, they're going to be the very kind of people you want to be around, and especially have around if indeed the police are just too many minutes away from trying to stop an intruder. So you've got some good points. So, Chris, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, sir. You have a blessed day.
Thank you. Well, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to North Carolina this time and talk to Jacob.
Hey, how you doing?
Very good. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, I'd like to make the counterpoint. You guys were talking about how taking God out of school is actually what's causing a lot of these shootings. But how does that play into the narrative that we also have church shootings?
Yeah, well, again, most of the church shootings I'm aware of, I'll take, maybe South Carolina, certainly the one in Texas, almost always those are done by atheists or individuals that are, actually angry at God.
I don't think they were done. I don't think they were exactly atheists. And that's kind of my next point, too.
Sutherland Springs, the guy for sure was atheist. I can't even say that he was anything but. And when I've looked at some of these people, their psychological profile really pretty scary, if anything. But go ahead.
Well, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
You can have one example. That's fine. That's anecdotal. But for the most part, a lot of the shooters, it really doesn't really matter. But religion does play a lot of effect to it, whether they were originally from that church, and that's why they had that as a target. But the other point I want to make is that we have a separation of church and state. So it's not anything to do with taking God out of church, God out of school. He was never meant to be there anyways, because then you get into the sticky situation of which God do you allow and which ones that you do not.
Well, again, one of the reasons we have what's called an equal access amendment is so that we can say that you have the same kind of equal opportunity, equal access. So if you have a debate club or a Bible club or a chess club, they all have equal standing. So if you want to have a Muslim club and you want to have a Christian club, fine, that's no problem there.
You can see all the kind of problems that will come about from having that kind of freedom with that kind of religion in a public place like that. That's why our founding fathers wanted to omit it from any public place, any government or public place. Now
that is incorrect. First of all, let me just try to educate you a little bit on that, because that was not the intent of the founding fathers. It certainly was not the intent of the First Amendment. And we did not even have the concept of separation of church and state in our Constitution until 1947 with the case that was brought before the Supreme Court, and then later gave us all of those other arguments. So maybe we can send you some material that would be helpful to educate you so you know a little bit more about how, in many cases, the founders had a Judeo-Christian perspective, intended that we would be speaking moral issues into our society. And
I don't necessarily think that they were Judeo-Christians. I mean, they knew these actual problems that would come about with actually designating particular religions.
Where's this dogmatism coming from? Okay, James Madison, who did he study under? He studied under Witherspoon at what today we call Princeton University. It was the College of New Jersey. Many people believe it was his Calvinistic view of human depravity, which is why we have the idea of a balance of powers and checks and balances and those kinds of things. Those were individuals.
Okay,
I'll give you one last statement, then we need to go to a break.
Okay. Is this country a Christian nation or a secular nation?
This was a country that was founded on Christian principles, and
But it's a secular country.
Well, it certainly has become that, and so back to our point that we were making before, I think getting God back into the schools makes a great deal of sense. And there's just a lot of miscommunication there about what our founders were, but that's, of course, one of the reasons we, on Point of View, so often talk about America's godly heritage. And if you find yourself saying, okay, I don't want to believe what you have to say, I want to read it for myself, my most recent book, Christians and Government, has a whole chapter on the separation of church and state. Where did the phrase come from? Well, it was in 1802. Thomas Jefferson, writing to the Danbury Baptist Association, talked about a wall of separation. But it wasn't until 1947 when Justice Hugo Black actually took that phrase really out of context and used that as a justification to have this idea of a separation of church and state. So Nevertheless, we'll cover that issue in the future, but we have a lot more phone calls, so we'll take those right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Lansing Housing Commission provides subsidized housing in central Michigan. In many of the facilities, the Housing Commission provides a community room. The commission often grants access to those community rooms for birthday parties, Boy Scout meetings, tutoring sessions, and other community events. However, the commission refused to grant access to the community rooms for religious worship services or programs. His Healing Hands Medical Clinic provides a range of services to the community inside the Housing Commission's facilities. When its leaders asked to use the community room for religious services on Sundays, the church was excluded. The commission explained that it was welcome to use the community room to meet the physical needs of the community, but could not say anything about Jesus or bring any Bibles with them. In court, the commission argued that their policy was permissible because it denied use of the community to all religions equally. But the court rejected that reasoning. Excluding all religions is the very definition of religious discrimination, which is not cured by discriminating against all religions equally. Government commissions are not permitted to pick and choose which viewpoint it will permit in public places and which it will refuse. The First Amendment requires our government to be neutral in dealing with various religious viewpoints that make up our public square. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Take a few more minutes. We'll have our Millennial Roundtable in the second hour, but let's take a few more phone calls. We'll run up to Alaska this time. KJNP and Curtis, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Oh, Kirby, I could take up your whole hour on it, but I won't. First off, it just tickles me when people try and tell me what I need in the way of anything. More people get killed with cars than get killed with guns in this country by a huge amount. Yet if you count the seats in your car and the people in your family, you'll find that most people have more cars than they need.
That's probably, and you could probably use that anywhere along the way. And that's why I thought that piece by David French was really helpful, because he really helps us understand that the three responses that, first of all, it shouldn't be based on fear. Well, yeah, but that's why we are supposed to buckle a seatbelt, or that you are actually needing certain kinds of things, but you don't need others, or actually that if you have a gun, it would be more dangerous for you to have a gun than not to have a gun.
Aren't all those arguments based on their fears?
And there's a fair amount of condescension, which I'm always up for a good discussion, even a little bit of, well, have you thought about this or what about that? Okay, I see your argument, but what about this? But instead, it's just the finger pointing. And Katie Pavlich the other day put out a very good piece. Actors lectured America again about gun control while men with assault weapons protected them at the Oscars. And she's got a picture, first of all, of the orange anti-gun violence pins that everybody was wearing. And then she's got a picture of, in this case, she says, good guys with guns protecting cultural elites. Good for me, but not for thee. She says, okay, how many assault rifles can you spot? I see a few. In other words, you see all the people that were part of law enforcement, including what looks like a fully armed SWAT team protecting those people at the Oscars. Well, if I have someone else who has a, quote, assault rifle or, an AR-15 or whatever it might be, then I don't need one because they're going to protect me. But at the same time, they're lecturing everybody else that you can't have one. So there's another one of those need kind of questions, isn't there?
There is. And on kids, here in Alaska, all of our high schools have rifle teams. Several of our junior highs have rifle teams. They all shoot intramurally, just like they do with other sports. I spend my weekends training kids to shoot. We start them at 8 years old. Most of our kids shoot their way through high school and college. And where else can your little 98-pound girl get a sports scholarship and do her way through college,
Pretty amazing. Well, again, I know you probably have had no problem at all because they've learned gun safety. They learn to be very responsible. They understand how to unload a weapon, how to clean a weapon, how to never point it at anything you don't plan to destroy, all the kinds of lessons that are taught by the NRA, taught by the Boy Scouts, taught by a variety of other groups. And so I appreciate you sharing that with us today.
Thanks, Kirby. Bye now.
And call again, because it sounds like you have a lot more to say, but I'm going to give a few more a chance to join the conversation. So let's go to New Mexico, KTGW. Chuck, what do you want to add to our conversation today?
Good afternoon. The founders of this country were very wise people, and I think that they included an armed citizenry for a good reason. An armed citizenry is the best deterrent to any foreign country or ideology from occupying the USA. And
that was a powerful argument. It was an argument made by George Mason and James Madison, who we were just talking about the founders just a minute ago. The phrase, a lot of people don't know, you'll get this in the latest booklet I have coming out here on the Second Amendment, actually comes from a Declaration of Rights that already existed, the phrase to keep and bear arms. So a lot of times people say, well, we don't know what that meant. Yes, we do. We even have the documents that they borrowed the phrase from. So they understood that there were two values in having armed citizenry. Number one, it prevents tyranny. And number two, it allows for self-defense. And at either point, when you say, well, you really don't need that. The latest bill by Senator Feinstein, essentially, if implemented, would ban, as I've heard it from people that have counted them up, 80% of the handguns and at least 50% of your rifles and shotguns. Well, that's pretty significant. It's not completely disarming the American people, but it's getting a lot closer than we've ever been since the founding of this country.
There's going to be a really serious problem if they pass laws to take away everybody's guns. They're going to have a real problem getting away from the citizenry.
And it's not going to happen. That's the point that David French is pointing out. But we're going to talk about it forever, but it's never going to happen. Go ahead.
Right. Hollywood, I just get so angry with those people. I mean, all they put out, I won't say that, I can't see the only thing they put out, but they put out so many movies that are just filled with violence. And like somebody earlier said, you don't get even. You don't, try to settle a problem. You just get even. You go out. If somebody, does something bad to you, you just go kill them. At least that's what Hollywood says. And then they turn their face the other direction and say, gun control, gun control. Nobody has a right to have a gun. Well, that's crazy.
Well, either you are or you aren't. And like you said, speaking on the one hand about the need for gun control, and then, of course, again, look up the piece by Katie Pavlich, because I just love the picture here that she was able to find, which showed all sorts of individuals who I think legitimately were trying to guard and protect those individuals at the Academy Awards. And those individuals were carrying the kind of weapons that at least some of the advocates for gun control want to only be in the hands of some law enforcement officers, SWAT teams, maybe the military, but not you and me. So that's kind of where we find ourselves. One more phone call. We'll go to Georgia in the Good News Network. Tony, what would you like to share with us today?
Well, I appreciate you taking my call, Kirby. I like the way you was, I guess, educating the atheists on that, because like I said, I was sitting there saying, I said, no, Kirby going to handle them. But it's like, when it comes down to a lot, the black community, a lot of them are not educated in what some of your even your previous caller just a while ago was even talking about with the type guns, with what's going on with Hollywood and issues behind why people, the First Amendment, when it comes down to even having a gun.
Yeah, well, here's a good point. Since I gather you are African American, where were the first gun control laws in America implemented? Well, they were implemented in the South in the 19th century to prevent what? African Americans. To prevent black people from having access to guns. So that's where some of the first gun control laws were really implemented, at least in the 19th century. I mean, you can come up with some other examples in the 18th century, but in terms of that, because now you had free men, and there was like, well, we simply can't do that in the Klan. So that's the kind of education we need to do. And Tony, I wish I had more time, but I am right up against a break. So what I will do is we will kind of change topics in the second hour, get into a millennial conversation, because Wednesday is our millennial roundtable. And even though we can't bring as many millennials to the table today, we're going to bring one, and that is Hannah will join us next. She's with Stand for Life. And we'll spend some time talking about the millennials and talking about even some of the pro-life issues that she mentioned yesterday with Penna Dexter, but we didn't have a chance to get into. And then, of course, throughout this week, we will continue looking at some of those issues. We didn't get to tariffs today. That will be a topic we'll postpone for another day. There will always be more time because there's always more topics. So let's take a break. If you would like to read a couple of the articles that we have been referring to today, the first one, Why Liberals Are Losing on Guns, The Divisive Debate, those are on our website, pointofview.net. In the second hour, when we talk with Stand for Life and Hannah, well, we have that on our website as well. So stay tuned. We'll have that conversation right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think you guys, y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Last hour today, if you would like to join our conversation, we're going to do our Millennial Roundtable. Oftentimes we do that for 2 hours, but today we've had a chance to bring back into the studio somebody, if you were listening yesterday, you had a chance to hear, Hannah Sultemeier, and she is the director of Stand for Life. And Hannah, it is great to have you back in the studio.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's fun to be here again.
You and Penna Dexter and one of your other associates was here yesterday, but we're going to kind of broaden the conversation because we talk about millennials. And it's interesting because there was a piece that just came out just a few days ago by the one of the writers, John Quiggin, in the New York Times. And the title of it is Millennial Means Nothing. And what he said is the Pew Research Center announced last week that it will define people born between 1981 and 1996 as members of the millennial generation, embracing a slightly narrow range of years, because I've always used from 1980 to 2000, so we can have an argument about all that. But what he went on to say, it would be better, though, if they announced the end to what I call the generation game, the insistence on dividing society into groups based on birth year and imputing different characteristics to each group. Well, let me add the disclaimer that I have to add so many times. When we talk about millennials, I say that it's probably never true that everybody in any particular cohort or generation are identical. And when I wrote a book years ago on the baby boom generation, I pointed out that there were sometimes exceptions to the rules. Well, if that was true for baby boomers or baby busters, it is really true for your generation. And that is, whenever I speak, I say, now I'm going to give you some general principles, some general rules, but there are as many exceptions as there are rules, because if there's ever been a diverse generation, it is yours, the millennial generation. Very, very diverse. So there are all sorts of exceptions to what we're going to talk about today. And, of course, he points out that there is even some books out right now that are suggesting that the baby boom generation is a bunch of sociopaths. And I love what he says here. He said, well, okay, look at this. If you say that they're a bunch of sociopaths, that doesn't work very well, because, first of all, when you talk about baby boomers, that could be everybody from Donald Trump to the 65-year-old woman who's been actually cleaning his motels, who's African-American. You know, I mean, he's using examples. So when I talk millennials today, we're certainly going to be talking about real diverse kinds of individuals. But Hannah, that's our first question. For your generation that is less church-based, you may go to church, a lot of your friends go to church, but a lot of your peers do not. The whole question of truth, absolute truth, is very different for the millennial generation, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like our culture, especially our generation, is not focused on absolute truth anymore. I feel like we have, in past years, have focused more on feelings and emotions instead of on absolute truth, which has contributed to this diverse generation. I feel like for believers and versus non-believers are no longer sitting, they're not sitting in a place where they are, they're not turning to biblical truth to form their opinions and ideas. They're focused on the media, social media, what's surrounding them in their day-to-day conversations, where believers, not all of them, but the hope is that believers are turning to absolute truth in Scripture.
Yes.
But social media has a crazy influence on the way people are forming their political views, their social views, their educational views, everything. Social media, the media, movies, everything has kind of turned gray. which has been really interesting for this generation.
Well, and again, we'll talk about social media because that's another driver for your generation. But back to churches for just a minute. I mean, this illustrates the point. The fastest growing demographic right now for the millennial generation, and then the next one, which they're calling iGen or Generation Z or whatever, are what are called nuns. Now, that's Nones. That means that they actually on Pew surveys say atheist, agnostic, or no preference. And that percentage has increased every single year. So the argument that we have oftentimes heard from people in the church is, well, these people are going to come back to church someday. You know, they're going to fly away, but they're like the swallows to Capistrano. They're going to come flying back into the church. When they have kids, maybe they'll have. But the problem is, if you were never in church in the first place, what makes you think they're going to, quote, come back to church? They weren't there. And the example I've used before, but I'll use it again because sometimes people don't always hear every example we use, is a friend of mine has been teaching at the Dallas Art Institute for years. And she actually teaches a whole series of classes, one on architecture. And when they do architecture, they go into a lot of buildings. And when she brings them into a church, half or more of them say, this is the first time I've ever been in a church. So for your generation, church is a little bit more of an uncertainty. The Bible isn't something they know. Right. And so as a result, it's not surprising that they're getting their ideas from their peers and from social media, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I feel like our generation has watched older generations and created and put them in this box. They've seen, they've stereotyped them as Christians being judgmental, as being more critical, as being exclusive. And so this generation has run completely opposite of that. They've swung the pendulum the entire opposite way. And they want to be as far from identifying with anything that fits in that stereotype, which is interesting because the church is actually doing a really good job of engaging controversial topics and social justice issues in a really cool way, which is
I think so. Yeah, and again, one of the things that we see in some of the surveys, and this was by Dave Kinnaman of the Barta Group, he wrote a book called Unchristian, and he asked your peers, you know, why aren't you a Christian? And the answers came back hypocritical. Of course, we've always heard that. You know, I've always heard people say, well, the hypocrites in the church. I said, well, then don't join it because you just add one more to it. But no, they were actually saying, no, I know a person who calls themselves a Christian, but he's a real hypocrite, or judgmental, or homophobic, that they were anti-gay or whatever. And so you go down that list and those resonate. And again, if you're perceiving the world through your emotions, you're certainly saying, well, I'm not going to make judgments. When we come back from the break, let's talk a little bit about Stand for Life, because one of the interesting puzzles for a lot of people is that a generation that isn't that Christian, isn't that dedicated to absolute values, doesn't want to make judgments or even moral judgments, nevertheless is without a doubt the most pro-life generation in American history. And so one of the articles we've posted here is a piece that came out in National Review, and also, if people would like to read it, my commentary that came out February 19th called Pro-Life Millennials. We're going to get into that a little bit more detail. So I want to talk about what you do at Stand for Life. I want to talk about how your generation turned out to be so pro-life, because the National Abortion Rights Action League, Planned Parenthood, was convinced that after 30 or 40 years, now it's been 45 years, that your generation would grow up just taking abortion for granted, and you would be the most pro-abortion generation. And instead, you become the most pro-life generation. So we're going to talk about that. And if you'd like to join us today, I'd love to hear from some of you millennials. Hannah is certainly one. And, of course, we normally have a round table of individuals, but today they had to put up with me. And, of course, we got Hannah. So I'm the token millennial anyway here. So we're going to come back and get into this. But what about this issue of pro-life millennials? Does that bode well for the future? And how can we begin to use those ideas to reach that generation with other ideas and topics? And what can the church do? We have a lot to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, Ryan Anderson responds to our transgender moment in his new book, When Harry Became Sally. He begins his discussion by comparing two movies. The classic film, When Harry Met Sally, explored the question of whether a man and a woman can really be just friends. More recently, the film The Danish Girl asked a different question. Can a man really become a woman? The film was based on the true story of the first known subject of sex reassignment surgery. America is in the midst of what has become the transgender moment. When he was on my radio program, we talked about how fast this all took place. Most Americans had never heard of transgender identity, but within a year it became the latest civil rights cause. He said that the book in many ways provides support for the actions by Dr. Paul McHugh. He is a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School who raised important questions about the effectiveness of hormonal treatments and sex reassignment surgery. This 250-page book with 30 pages of endnotes attempts to provide a comprehensive look at the transgender movement and policies that have been proposed to address the demands of transgender activists. We also talked about how transgender concepts are being taught in the schools. There's the genderbread person that is supposed to help children sort through how their gender identity and gender expression relates to their biological sex. And there is the gender unicorn that is supposed to help them understand who they may be physically attracted to and emotionally attracted to. He also documents how some young people exhibit gender dysphoria but later become more comfortable with their sexuality. Transgender activists have so misrepresented this book that I wonder if they even read the same book I read. That is one more reason why I recommend that you get the book and read it for yourself. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Irwin Brothers Entertainment, I Can Only Imagine. Rated PG, in theaters March 16th. More information at ICanOnlyImagine.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, Millennial Roundtable. But for just a few minutes, we want to talk about these pro-life millennials. First of all, one of our articles, it will be our third article here, is one that is kind of a blog post that appeared in National Review. But let me take you back to my commentary that aired on February 19th. My commentary comes out every day, and you can sign up to receive it, and your local radio station may carry it. But in the Washington Post, interestingly enough, you have Eugene Scott, who was arguing back when, of course, we had the 45th commemoration of Roe versus Wade, that the culture battle over abortion is not over. And as I said, Hannah, just a minute ago, that's not what the National Abortion Rights Action League or Planned Parenthood would have actually guessed. You're the director of Stand for Life, so you've probably thought about this more than anything else. But most people would have thought that after 45 years of legalized abortion, you and your peers growing up seeing abortion as a woman's right and as totally legal in 50 states for all 9 months, except for the few states that may be restricted one way or another, they would assume that your generation would be the most pro-abortion generation, and lo and behold, you're the most pro-life generation. Can you give us some explanation why?
Yes, absolutely. It has been incredible what the Lord has done through the pro-life conversation and the way that he has brought an awareness for those that he's created in his image in the details of this discussion. I think one of the greatest contributions to why our millennial generation is extremely pro-life is because of social media.
Yes.
That has played a huge portion, in addition to sonograms, in addition to scientific studies, just being educated. But social media and stories have put a face and a name behind the statistics that generations previous to us have put out there. And so it's been this exciting time for millennials because we can hear one story and our hearts and our minds are changed in the way that we think about it, because we realize, whoa, that statistic or that story, that person who walked through abortion, or that story of someone who chose life, that's a real person. And so it's really cool. I got to hear Sho Baraka speak last year, and he said something that has stuck with me. Storytelling is identity formation. And so as you've seen, even in the way of just even secular culture, we've watched advertisements change into storytelling. We've watched the pro-life movement grow into the storytelling movement. And that's what's been so exciting for Stand for Life, and that the Lord grew this movement into be a social media storytelling movement. Because we are able to engage our community and engage strangers and friends on this discussion, because it feels more tangible to us, because we see the names and the faces behind it.
You know, when we talk about the abortion decision 45 years ago, Marlon Maddox started this radio program 45 years ago. So there's kind of an interesting connection there. Yeah. But I remember being with Marlon even before I was the co-host with him and the guest host, even just sometimes being on the program, that in the 1980s, something developed that seemingly, again, changed the abortion debate. And that was the development of ultrasound and sonograms, which provided a window to the womb. Wow. And I think that's another aspect of that. When you are told as a pregnant woman in an abortion clinic that it's just a piece of flesh, it is a piece of protoplasm, it's products of conception, then you can depersonalize it. When you see on that screen, that's my baby. And this is one of the reasons why in a Planned Parenthood clinic, if they use a sonogram, maybe for late-term abortions, they turn it away because they don't want you to see that. And if you can get a pregnant woman into a pregnancy resource center, one of those traveling pro-life vans, and she sees her baby, it changes everything, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Because you see this thing that is talked about theoretically, this thing that is just a fetus or just a tissue. You see that it has a heartbeat. You see that it has fingers. You see that the eye sockets are forming. You see the development of life and from the ultrasound or sonogram. It's amazing.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah. And by the way, while we're talking about social media, I should have mentioned this. Yesterday, you talked about how Stand for Life started. Tell that story again. I know some people might have heard it if they were listening just at this moment yesterday, but if they were tuning in or tuning out, tell the story again, because that, again, just shows, again, how Stand for Life has had such an impact just with something like what would be on an Instagram photo. Talk about that.
Absolutely. So the summer of 2015, once the Center for Medical Progress undercover Planned Parenthood videos leaked, the founder of Stand for Life, Jess Barfield, had watched the 7th video and just felt this incredible stirring from the Lord that, hey, I need to do something. She just couldn't sit there and watch it and say nothing, but she didn't know how to respond. And she didn't know where to start. She has grown up in a Christian home, has claimed to be pro-life her entire life, but she didn't know how to respond. Yeah. And so Jess is driving home from the ranch with her 2 boys in the back. They were sound asleep. She says that was a miracle of itself in the back of her car. And she said the Lord gave her this vision for the life filter that you'll see on Stand for Life's photos. It says LIFE, and it's a 4 grayscale image that's placed over the photos on our feed. But she developed this vision for the life filter, which is incredible in itself as well, because Jess is a very, very talented wedding photographer in DFW. But she would not say that, and she would say this herself, but she would not say she enjoys graphic design or that's her favorite. But she went home, designed the filter, placed it on her personal Facebook profile picture, and said, with all the love and grace in my heart, I believe that every life is valuable. And she looked to her husband and she said, what should I hashtag something? And she hashtagged Stand for Life.
Stand for Life.
And it went viral. Within hours, she had hundreds of people commenting on the photo saying, hey, I want to respond to you and I don't know how to respond. I want to place this image over my profile picture. Within 24 hours, hundreds of people have reached out to her personal social media accounts, her inbox, and people were asking, hey, how do I get the filter? How do I get the filter? So Jess was manually filtering it and then said, hey, I got to gather a team of people. So she gathered a team of creatives and photographers, and they sat down in the living room. And they're like, the Lord just doesn't make things go viral for no reason, but I need help to manually filter these photos. And so as they were filtering these photos and they started compiling the photos together, there was a gentleman who jumped in to make a single page landing platform to automatically filter the photos so they wouldn't have to. But as they were sorting through people's photos as they were tagged, they realized that people were organically sharing why they believed in the sanctity of life and why they thought life was valuable. So Jess and this team of creatives said, hey, what if we just compiled a platform of people's stories? Why don't we start encouraging people to unify the voice that every life is valuable and that life was created in the image of God and it is beautiful and deserves to be celebrated? And so that was the start of Stand for Life, something that went viral that was totally by the Lord's grace.
I think
and
so.
Since then, we've shared over 700 stories of life to show hope to people who need it most.
Let me just mention, if you go to standforlife.org or just click on the picture of Hannah, you can find it there. You have the why stories, about us, do something. Then you also have share your story, and you have a store right now, and there's all sorts of goodies in the store there as well. So standforlife.org, and that just shows you, again, the power of social media. As we've said before, sometimes, Hannah, even as we hear a good interview, we ask people to maybe click the watch button or the share button or the listen button and send it on to someone else, and to actually either send people to our YouTube channel or to watch it on Facebook Live or to listen to it or send the podcast, because you just simply don't know how some person's story would have impact on someone else. And we had an individual in the studio here. His name's Don, and he's from Stockton area, and he's shared that story. And I've seen how so many people have benefited from his stories of standing out in front of clinics and being a pro-life testimony. And I've seen some of this just simply go viral because it makes an impact in your life and you share it with someone else, you have no idea of the impact it would have on their life as well.
Absolutely. And social media, the effects of social media are so far-reaching. And the interesting thing about social media is that you can choose to engage or not engage, which is kind of is really, really unique that the Lord has designed social media even in that way, that you don't fully know what heart change and what different thoughts are happening behind the screen. But what we've seen just in these 2.5 years since organization started, we have reached close to 30 million people through sharing
Just
stories
amazing.
of life, which is amazing. And we've seen heart change and hope be given in ways that we couldn't have even planned for. There was a close friend of the Stand for Life community last fall who reached out to us, and she shared with us that, hey, I just want to go to lunch and tell you why Stand for Life impacted me. So we sat down at lunch with her, and she's like, hey, I'm just going to get straight to the point. I found myself in a crisis pregnancy this past August. And I've been someone who has been Christian my entire life, claimed that I've been pro-life my entire life. But when I found myself in this pregnancy, everything that I believe just really came to surface. And she confronted the guy that she had been dating at the time. And unfortunately, he suggested abortion multiple times. But he it put her in a place where she wasn't sure what to do. Anyways, so cool. Stand for Life stories ended up crossing her path and providing her hope just at the time that she needed it most.
Another way to save one of those babies. We come back, we're going to spend some time talking about, okay, what can we do inside the church? Try to give you some shoe leather to some of the things we're talking about here. How can we maybe stand with some of these pro-life groups and even crisis pregnancy centers, pregnancy resource centers? So we have a lot more to cover. We'll do that with Hannah right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, we came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture. Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this. listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, feel free to do so. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know a little bit more of Stand for Life, go to standforlife.org or simply go to Point of View. Hannah Sultemeier is with us, and she is the director and in studio with us today. If, by the way, you're listening to this and saying, boy, I'd like to share these stories, you can go to their website. Or if you'd like to share this interview, again, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, click on that watch button, and you can download that or the listen button and send the podcast, or you can go to the YouTube channel or even find it on Facebook Live. There are just so many different ways you can take this material, pass it on to others, and make a difference. And just before we talk about what we should do in the church, I thought I'd mention that one of the articles we posted is on pro-life millennials, and Michael New, who wrote that, Hannah, you've read this already, was looking at what's called the GSS survey. Now, for people that really get into statistics, and Steve Cable's been on this program, and he delves into these statistics, the General Social Survey is kind of the gold standard. And they've been asking really the same 6 questions about abortion since the early 1970s. And what they have found is a significant shift in your generation. So whether it's due to having ultrasound and sonograms, whether it's due to social media, whether it's due to the fact that sometimes they look around and say, you know, I would have had a brother and sister, but I think you aborted them, or I would have had some more of classmates if you hadn't aborted them. Your generation is the most pro-life generation, and we've seen a remarkable shift about around the year 2000. So that is something that you can read about more, and that's another article you might want to post. But let's, before we take some phone calls, again, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to join our conversation today, we'd love to hear your comments. And if you want to share your own story and like to remain anonymous, you can do that. And we'll get to some of those calls in just a minute. Hannah, I know you thought a lot about what can we do in the churches? How can those of us in the church help you in Stand for Life, and how can Stand for Life help us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think CareNet is a great organization that studies statistics behind women who are choosing life and women that are walking through crisis pregnancies. But they put out some really interesting, sobering statistics that 4 out of 10 women are actually attending church within the month at the first time of their abortion. And it's really interesting because you would think, similar to the story that I shared earlier, okay, if they know the gospel, if they're Christian, if they know what Scripture says, then abortion must be unthinkable. And I think that sometimes we think that that is the assumption, but I think this is such a unique opportunity for the church to step into this conversation. There's so many churches who are doing it well, but it really is the church's role to help make abortion unthinkable. I think it's really cool watching churches bring this conversation to the pulpit and start challenging people to start really think about what does it mean to be pro-life. I know that I've been challenged in incredible ways, but what does it mean to be pro-life from womb to tomb? What does it look like? And how do these different social justice issues play into the life conversation?
Very good.
Which is really what millennials are passionate about. Millennials are also the generation that ask why, which I think has greatly contributed to why this generation is the most pro-life generation, because they've asked why, and then they've seen answers of why life is valuable.
Yes.
They've seen pictures, they've seen names, they've seen statistics, they've seen science, they've seen it through the window of the womb. It's beautiful and it's transforming culture. But I really think that the role of the church in this conversation is to be proactive instead of reactive. There's a lot of churches who are doing this well, but as believers, we really need to be starting a conversation of what does it mean to be pro-life, and are we loving our neighbor well? I think sometimes it can be really scary to jump into the pro-life conversation. Some people disqualify themselves because they say, hey, I haven't walked through a crisis pregnancy, or I haven't walked through, I don't know someone who's a single mom, or I haven't had to be faced with the choice of life. But the thing is that we all are invited into the pro-life arena, and especially as believers, we definitely have hundreds of opportunities to do this. And it seems complicated and scary, but it's really simple. Some of the ways that we've really loved, just in the last 2.5 years of sharing stories on Stand for Life, we've learned so many tangible ways that we can enter in this conversation, and getting to walk alongside of churches and see how people are coming around, people who are faced with a choice of life. Some of those can be just getting to start a relationship with your neighbor so that if they do come in contact with someone who is faced with a crisis pregnancy or themselves is faced with a choice of life, that they know that there's someone who's going to do community with them. I think one of the greatest things, I come from a family, I'm one of 10 in my home. My family is a foster and adopted family. And I watched how valuable just bringing a meal to my home was. I think that we take for granted those small things, think that we have to change something to be able to contribute to the pro-life arena, but the church really has an opportunity to love our neighbors well, and simply just become aware of what our surroundings are. The church's role is also just to equip people with wisdom and knowledge of what the pro-life conversation looks like, because I feel like we're not all called to foster, we're not all called to adopt, we're not all called to work at a crisis pregnancy center, but we are called to be the hands and feet of Jesus. And so as believers, we have lots of opportunities to step into this conversation, get to know the people around you, and simply just ask, hey, what's your story? What do you wish people knew about your story? And we've found when we ask that question, people instantly dive into a deeper, intimate part of their story, which allows the relationship to grow.
That's great. Would you like to take some phone calls? Let's see if we could grab a few here, and we've got some other comments as well. And if you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to know a little bit more about Stand for Life, well, we have the link there. And if you would like to know some of the stories or like to share your story, that's a way that you can do so online. If you'd like to share some of your comments or your story on air, that is a possibility as well. 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Indiana and talk to Larry. Larry, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for taking my call. I think it would be a great benefit to this young lady's effort since 1973, meaning over 61 million babies have been aborted, to have people can get printouts or pictures of the sonograms now. A 30-year-old son or daughter that could be introduced in two ways. Have the mother or the father or the both of them show the picture of the sonogram and say, at that point, pro-abortion is considered it a lump of flesh and things like you described earlier. Then have them introduce their son or daughter, walk on stage with their children. I'm a father, a grandfather, and a great-grandfather. You take that one son or that one daughter out of the picture, none of the others would have existed.
Well said. We've talked about that before. And I'd never really thought about that because, you take out somebody in the previous generation, then all the ones, the pyramid afterwards simply disappear. Go ahead.
Yes, and also the best argument that I found against abortion is in Psalms 139, 13, 14.
Yes.
Yes.
Fearfully and wonderfully made, for sure. Larry, thank you so much for sharing that today. Good material.
Thank you. God bless.
We have all sorts of other calls, but I thought just for a minute we might, as we were talking about the church, if somebody wanted to come alongside or have you come and speak or would like to get some materials, what's available for people in churches? Because I know some pastors have said, okay, we'd like to have a pregnancy center, but I don't know how to do that. You just said CareNet. What's CareNet? In other words, you almost need to walk them step by step. Can you do that for somebody?
Yeah, absolutely. So depending on, I'm going to take these off here, depending on just what their interest is to come alongside of the church, there are so many churches who are diving into different parts of this pro-life conversation, whether that is adoption, whether that is abortion recovery ministries, whether that is foster care information, or CareNet has a program called Making Life Disciples, where they are helping come alongside of churches to help them be proactive in this conversation instead of being on their heels, so that they can provide hope and grace and empathy from the get-go and help people walk through that. And so what I would encourage people is to connect with us on our site and connect by starting just to read the stories, but then also we have partners that we partner with that we can point people to get more information. And coming alongside of the church, if your church isn't doing something now, I would encourage you to reach out and ask, how can you get involved? The Lord is moving in so many powerful ways within the church. And like I mentioned earlier, there's so many opportunities for us to join the pro-life conversation and to make a difference in our community by just starting a conversation. So I would encourage you to reach out to your church and see how you can become involved. And if you do have a story reach out to your church and share, because that can be used for the glory of God in so many powerful ways.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll come back and take some more phone calls. And also just want to get back to this issue, again, social justice warriors, millennials are. But on the one hand, they believe that abortion is wrong, but they still value tolerance. And it brings us back to the John Stone Street quote the other day, where this is a generation not only most likely to be pro-life, but also most likely, even if it's pro-life, to drive a pregnant woman to an abortion clinic instead of to a pregnancy resource center. So we got to talk about that issue and some other questions about what can happen in the church. So we will take those calls right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Lansing Housing Commission provides subsidized housing in central Michigan. In many of the facilities, the Housing Commission provides a community room. The commission often grants access to those community rooms for birthday parties, Boy Scout meetings, tutoring sessions, and other community events. However, the commission refused to grant access to the community rooms for religious worship services or programs. His Healing Hands Medical Clinic provides a range of services to the community inside the Housing Commission's facilities. When its leaders asked to use the community room for religious services on Sundays, the church was excluded. The commission explained that it was welcome to use the community room to meet the physical needs of the community, but could not say anything about Jesus or bring any Bibles with them. In court, the commission argued that their policy was permissible because it denied use of the community to all religions equally. But the court rejected that reasoning. Excluding all religions is the very definition of religious discrimination, which is not cured by discriminating against all religions equally. Government commissions are not permitted to pick and choose which viewpoint it will permit in public places and which it will refuse. The First Amendment requires our government to be neutral in dealing with various religious viewpoints that make up our public square. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hannah Sultemeier with us, and again, she is with Stand for Life as the director. And let's take some more phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Georgia. Jacob, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thanks, Kerby. My question was to the young lady who Stand for Life is, how are they doing in penetrating the black churches where just about 35-40% of all abortion is done out of the black culture? How are you doing in order to get inside of those churches to give them, to inform them?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that. thus far, with us being a fairly new organization, we have been able to bring some awareness to this by sharing people's stories. So we have shared stories. We share stories from the first person perspective on our platform. So there has been some men and women who have brought an awareness to this conversation on our platform. And since everything that we do on Stand for Life is done through the avenue of storytelling, that has been the first approach that we have taken to this, by bringing an awareness to the Black church and the Black issue that is going on in the abortion discussion. And something that we're hoping to dive into more is connecting with churches that provide the resources of the stories, because I think that a lot of this issues, a lot of people don't know that this is going on.
Yeah. And even in the Black church, I mean, as we say, the percentages that Jacob just mentioned are astounding.
Yes.
Especially when, Jacob, you are well aware that some of the Black leaders are seen as pro-abortion when it's affecting their own community in some devastating ways, right?
Yes. You know, Kerby, I go around speaking inside of different churches. It is almost like the people are naive of this, and the major reason is the pastors are ignorant of it, and they fear to stand up and preach about it. And it is very hard to get into the church, and I'm Black, when they find out what you want to talk about.
Yeah, I can imagine. But again, I would hope that maybe Jacob can connect up with you, because he may know some stories.
Absolutely.
And I think it would be great to have more stories from the Hispanic community and the Black community and others on the website. And then also just to see if that opens some doors. It's amazing how, in your generation especially, storytelling is the way to the heart and the head, don't you think?
Absolutely. It really is. Storytelling penetrates the heart like nothing else. So we would absolutely love to connect with you, Jacob. Would love to have you reach out so that we can continue to learn. I feel like this is an evolving conversation.
Sure.
And so would love to have you reach out. But storytelling is absolutely the way to see hearts change in this discussion.
We have some other callers I might want to get to, but let me ask the question we just mentioned a minute ago. You are in a generation where the highest value that starts with the letter T is no longer truth. It's a post-truth culture. The highest value with the letter T is tolerance.
Yes.
And that's the problem, is that on the one hand, you have a generation that is pro-life, although it wouldn't always want to use that term because, well, that's political. Right. But on the one hand, they would certainly say, I think abortion is wrong because that's a justice issue, and that would be unfair to do that. But on the other hand, they wouldn't necessarily try to talk a friend out of an abortion. They might even take a friend to an abortion clinic. So that's sort of the next step, isn't it?
Yes, and it's really interesting. I feel like our generation has been confused with the difference between tolerance and not being judgmental.
Yes.
That line has completely been blurred. I feel like tolerance is very different than being non-judgmental. And it has become this thing that our generation has watched, like I mentioned earlier, our parents' generation and older generations maybe attack issues a little bit more critically and harshly. And because we've been so turned off by that, we've gone the exact opposite way. We have instead wanted to be silent and say nothing. And so it's interesting in this conversation because, which I feel like the church has such a cool opportunity to step into this and explain the differences, because loving someone like Jesus loves us is very different than saying nothing. And I think sometimes our generation forgets that our short-term gratification can lead people to more hurtful, painful, long-term effects. And I feel like that's something that keeps coming up with this tolerant generation, is that we make short-term fixes instead of leading people to truth, diving into the mess, hard stuff at the beginning, just because our generation wants to say, hey, if it makes you happy, do it.
Yeah. Well, and that brings me to a point, and maybe the last one we'll have today, and that is on these stories, some of those which are so poignant, and I've certainly done this show for 30 plus years, is I will have women call in and say, I got an abortion in the 1970s, and I am still feeling pain about it to this very day, which I think sets aside the myth that you get from the pro-abortion group that, oh, this is just a momentary crisis, but then it's gone and you'll never think about it again. And so in some respects, the stories you can share there are not only that this is a long-lasting pain, but also the victory, right? That
Right.
there is hope for healing
Yes.
for post-abortive women, right?
Yes, there's a sweet lady who has followed us almost since the beginning, which is just a testament to exactly what you're saying. She had read our stories on Stand for Life. We have shared stories of abortion redemption and healing on our platform, that there is the hope of Jesus that comes and can be given freely to people who have walked through that pain. But she had watched our stories, commented on almost every single one of our posts, has loved on our storytellers so well. But about a year and a half in, felt the courage to share her story of abortion. And she shared with us that it wasn't until a couple months before that she had openly even said the word abortion and talking about her story. But she said that just talking about it brought her so much freedom that she was trapped in for so long, many, many years ago, from that choice that she made a long time ago.
You know, again, I've shared this story, but I'll do it again because I want to encourage pastors to do the same. But years and years ago, back when they first started talking about the sanctity of life, and that's almost 30 years ago, when I was teaching a Sunday school class, I spoke on the subject of abortion and ended early saying, does anybody have any questions or comments? And this woman stands up and says, I've had an abortion. And the whole place goes, and she says, my kids used to wonder, why do you hate your birthday? And I came to realize that I had gotten this abortion on my birthday. And so we're all crying our eyes out. She's sharing all that. She sits down. Another woman stands up, says, I had an abortion too, and I've never felt the freedom to tell anybody.
Wow.
And then we're all crying again.
Yeah.
And she sits down, and a third one gets up, and we're in a Sunday school class. It's only 40 people. And I'm like, looking around, and I'm realizing if you just provide a context for people to tell their stories. So that's why I'm so excited about Stand for Life. As somebody, as a matter of fact, I have some people right now that want to share their story, but we're out of time. If they'd like to share their story online, how do they do that?
Absolutely. You'll just go to standforlife.org and you'll click the Share Your Story tab, and we actually have a pamphlet on there that you can download to walk through how to share your story.
Share it, yes.
And Lindsay on our team will reach out to you personally and engage back and forth if you have questions of how to share your story. But if you are someone out there that has walked through an abortion or just just felt like you could share your story, we want you to know that the Lord offers you healing, and he offers you his free gift of grace, and he is covering you with his love. And we would love to connect you to some incredible resources to help you walk through that. And so know that you are not alone, and we would be honored to connect with you.
Standforlife.org. Hannah, it's been great to have you in the studio. We need
Thanks
to have you in for more
in.
than just an hour. We'll do that. We'll do the Millennial Roundtable.
Yes.
I see some people that want to share their testimony. We can't do it on the air, but you can do it online. And so take the opportunity to follow up on that. And Hannah, thank you so very much for being so faithful on this pro-life issue.
Thank you for having me.
Again, we have a link to standforlife.org. Also, this article on pro-life millennials. I would encourage you to read it, or my commentary, February 19th. I think you will find some very good pieces of information that you might want to use in an email or other venues. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants his best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally